Hey guys, and welcome to the Week 8 edition of the Fantasy Points XFL Breakdown. I'm your host, Jake Tribbey, and I've got Chris Wecht here by my side to help us break down every angle of the Week 8 XFL slate. Chris, how are you doing today, and how did your Week 7 go?
I'm doing good. Week 7 was middle of the road week. The Brandon Silver's questionable news made me get on a lot more Cole McDonald than I initially was, which was probably the smart decision, but it took me off a little bit of more Dormady than I would have liked to come off of given his performance. But other than that, yeah, I think we hit on a lot of things that we talked about on the show last week.
Yeah, I thought our projections were pretty solid last week. I had a weird main slate because I didn't cash many teams, but I finished ninth in the $15. Actually, had a decent chance to win that, so I felt okay about that. I got smoked in the Houston Showdown contest though because I had so much Cole McDonald captain, and
Yeah,
he wasn't anywhere close to optimal. And I
no.
mean, I think that was a pretty common mistake that a lot of sharp players made, and honestly, I don't think calling it a mistake is fair. You know, swapping to Cole
Yeah.
McDonald because you thought you were behind, I think was definitely the right decision. And thankfully, you know, I mostly swapped McCarron teams, but I did
Mhm.
swap a few Dormady teams, and I'm sure that cost me a little bit of money. But you know, I don't think people want to hear about last week as much as they do these upcoming games. So our first game this week, Saturday at 1 p.m. The Vegas Vipers at the St. Louis Battlehawks. The total here is 46. St. Louis is favored by 7. Chris, any bets before we get into the fantasy side of things?
Not nothing I feel super strongly about. Maybe I do like the under a little bit. I think this game's 46 is just a high over under. I know Vegas has been in a lot of high scoring games because their defense is bad and their offense has been surprisingly capable despite all their QB play. But 46 is just a lot of points for an XFL game where especially one with not the best QB play.
Yeah, I'm with you. I do lean towards the under, but I don't think I'm going to bet anything here. Injuries. We have a decent amount to cover here. Jeff Badet out with a thigh injury. That's pretty big news. We'll get to the implications there in a minute. Geronimo Allison, probable with a back injury. He looks very likely to play after 2 full practices this week. Rod Smith, probable with a knee injury. Also very likely to play after a full practice on Thursday. And Sing Q Sweeting, probable with an ankle injury. Very likely to play after 2 full practices this week. On the St. Louis side of things, AJ McCarron is questionable with a shoulder injury. He was limited in practice on Wednesday and Thursday. I think he plays, but certainly something to monitor. Nick Tiano would be expected to start if McCarron can't go. You know, McCarron is probably the best quarterback in the XFL, so that would really hurt the fantasy value of all these St. Louis pass catchers, and probably Brian Hill as well, just because we'd expect the offense to score fewer points. So definitely keep an eye on that McCarron news as we move closer towards this game. Chris, starting on the Vegas side of things, we saw Jalen McClendon actually play a pretty good game last week. He scored 26 DraftKings points, over 260 passing yards, graded pretty well at around a 70 grade from PFF. I rewatched this game and he threw some pretty nice passes. I mean, I really liked the way that they ran this offense. It kind of reminded me a lot of the way DC runs their offense, really suited his skill set. How are you handling Jalen McClendon? And then, what do you think about these pass catchers with Badet out?
So McClendon got a big price bump. He's up to 9,200 this week, and so it's going to be much harder for him to pay off that price tag. But I think he's still a good play. I don't think a lot of people will play him because of the price jump. Badet out definitely is not good for him, but Geronimo Allison, Martavis Bryant, these guys have all had played time in the NFL and stuck around a little bit. So it's not like has totally nobody to work with. And so you could pretty much stack him with, Sweeting, even Matthew Sexton. Like there's a lot of cheap options. So I think his high price tag can be offset a little bit with his primary stacking partners that you would put him with. So yeah, I'll definitely have some McClendon in my lineups.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think he makes a lot of sense. It'll be interesting to see how these wide receiver rotations break down with Badet out. Last week we saw Geronimo Allison with a 94% route share, Matthew Sexton at 77%, Q Sweeting at 71%, and then Martavis Bryant was all the way down around 35%. They've been kind of all over the map. Not quite
Mhm.
as a team like Arlington, but certainly some inconsistency with these wide receiver rotations after Badette. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Martavis Bryant in a full-time role. I think all four of those guys are playable. I did write up both Sweeting and Sexton as pretty strong values because they're so cheap. Sweeting, I think 5,300 and Sexton right around like 37, 38. Between the two, I think I prefer Sweeting a little bit just because he looks really dynamic with the ball in his hands.
Yeah, I'd
But
probably rank them Sweeting, Sexton, Allison, Bryant if I was picking the orders of what I would want to stack them with.
yeah, I think I'd line up with you there. But yeah, I mean, all four are in play, and it's
Mhm.
nice to have some of these cheaper options to mix in with McClendon. I mean, like we said, pretty much all these guys are viable here. Running back for Vegas, I mean, we've seen a pretty condensed two-man rotation ever since the offensive coordinator change. Do you have any strong leans here?
Neither guy is super flashy. If I'm playing one, it's probably John Lovett just because he
Yeah.
gets so much of the passing work and just PPR. He can get there much easier than Rod Smith, who kind of has to get into the end zone for him to be a good play.
Hmm.
Yeah, but I have no. I mean, maybe he gets a slight target bump share with Badette out, or because of how much of the pie Badette was taking up.
Yeah.
I think he's fine at 5,200.
Yeah, I think Lovett is pretty decent. He'll probably end up making my 4 game player pool. I probably won't be touching Rod Smith at least for the 4 game slate. Especially in these like negative game script spots. I mean, Vegas, underdogs by 7 points. I think Lovett makes a lot of sense. I mean, he's pretty heavily involved in the passing game, especially when they're losing, and he's made a lot of plays in the receiving game. I mean, he's shown some explosiveness, had some long receiving touchdowns. All right. Moving on to the St. Louis side of things. For the purposes of this discussion, I think it's fair to assume, or I think it's fair for us to assume that AJ McCarron plays. That's sort of my lean, but again, he is listed as questionable, so important for the audience to keep that in mind. That said, McCarron, like most weeks, feels like a pretty decent play. This Vegas defense is like a total disaster. Pretty clearly the second worst in the league after Orlando. And yeah, the St. Louis offense has been, clicking for most of the season. My question is, how do you plan on stacking McCarron? Do you have wide receivers you prefer here?
Yeah, so Butler doesn't project for us super well this week. I still think he's a fine play, but he's going to be popular like usual. Shepard's also going to be pretty popular, probably. I mean, people are going to want to play the St. Louis side. So I'd probably try to mix in, like, don't stack Butler and Shepard. Maybe pick one of the two and mix in Aitman. Aitman is probably fine. Prol is probably fine as a second option. I would mix and match it that way.
Yeah, so I actually really like Aitman this week. He's only 4,100,
Yeah.
which I think is a pretty compelling price tag. Obviously, if he was still in that like 7-8K range, he would just be totally unplayable. But in his first game back since week 3, he had a 55% route share, 14%
Hmm.
target share. He also led the team in inside the 10 targets with 2. I think both of those were actually end zone targets. So he's still regarded as, like arguably their top end zone threat, probably right there with Hakeem Butler, at least in the coach's eyes. If he just catches one touchdown, like he gets there for you, and he's got the NFL pedigree. He's a pretty talented guy. I actually like Aitman a lot as a salary saving option. That said, there's a real chance he gets 3 targets, couple catches for 20 yards or so. It's also clear that the team values Darius Shepard a little bit more highly than they do Aitman. At the same time, though, I mean, 4,100 for a guy of Aitman's talent who's probably going to get 60% plus route share in this offense. I think it's pretty nice.
Would you avoid stacking Shepard and Aitman because they kind of play the same role in the offense?
I don't think so. I do think they're okay together. I mean, there's probably a slight negative correlation there. But yeah, I mean, if McCarron throws 3 or 4 touchdowns, I think both
Then
guys
yeah,
could absolutely get there.
yeah.
But yeah, I like Aitman a lot. Prohl's fine. He's been
It just
priced up a
doesn't seem to
lot.
have much of a ceiling in any of these
Yeah,
teams.
and with Aitman returning, I mean, it's largely killed the value of these ancillary guys, at least for the 4 game slate. I mean,
Oh yeah.
Stephen Mitchell and Gary Jennings, George Campbell.
Yep.
There's just really not much there. So you're really only concerning yourself with those guys for showdown.
If
All right.
McCarron was out, Nick Tiano at 6,000. I mean, that's got to be a pretty nice play, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. He would absolutely pop as a value. I mean, that the thing is like we're still not like, we really don't have a good idea on if he's that good or not. But the matchup's really strong. I mean, how much do you think? Let me see here. So their implied team total is 26.8 right now. What do you think it would be if Tiana was starting? Maybe 22?
Yeah, I was going to say 20, 21, 22, something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, at 6,000, I still think that's a reasonable enough offensive expectation to say like, yeah, you can absolutely play this guy, and he has solid receivers to match up with. I mean, these receivers are good enough too that he doesn't even have to be that good if they could just make it happen after the catch, right? So, yeah, I think he's fine if he plays. Not a guy I'd be super excited about, but a guy that would certainly make his way into my teams because he's so cheap. Moving on to running back, I mean, Brian Hill kind of feels like the same old here. He's he's one of the league's premier bell cows, around a 70% snap share, getting a ton of the pass game work, occasionally getting vultured at the goal line. We've seen a bit of a rotation here for this RB2 spot. I believe in week 6, it was Kareem Walker. Last week, we saw a bit more Mateo Durant. Unfortunately, those guys are getting red zone touches. So that's that. But that's really the only negative thing you can say about Brian Hill, especially against, one of the league's worst rush defenses. With such a high implied team total, he's hard not to love, right?
Yeah. I mean, in this matchup, he probably should be 40+% owned, something like that. And I don't even think that's too high.
Yeah, I would think so. We do have some other cheaper options. We'll talk about Jaquez Patrick and Letty Brown a little bit later. I do think those guys will catch some ownership. Abram Smith also,
I think I'd much rather play Hill over Abram Smith.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I do think Abram Smith will soak up some ownership though. So I don't know. I mean, for ownership with Hill, I kind of lean, like 30 to 35%. I don't think it will be crazy because Jaquez Patrick projects so well everywhere else. But yeah, I mean, I like Brian Hill a lot. I imagine I'll probably at worst end up in line with the field, maybe a little overweight there. Yeah. Do you have any extra thoughts on this St. Louis backfield before we move on?
Nope, we're good.
Cool. And then, yeah, for showdown purposes, I would definitely prefer Mateo Durant over Kareem Walker, but just know that is a pretty dicey scenario to play. It could certainly be Kareem Walker too. All right, moving on to our second game on Saturday. This is a Saturday 4 p.m. kickoff. It's the Arlington Renegades at the Orlando Guardians. The total here is 42.5. Orlando is favored by 1.5. Chris, any bets that you like here?
Yeah, the Orlando hatred is just not. Vegas just hates this team. They're so much better with Dormady, and Arlington is. I mean, they can't score. They're probably averaging around 10 points a game for the past since week 1, maybe. I mean, yeah, Orlando's got to be Orlando minus 1.5 seems like an awesome bet.
Yeah, from week 2 onward, Arlington has averaged 11.8 points per game. The Orlando defense, excluding their game that they played against Arlington, is giving up 34 points per game. The game that they played against Arlington in week 3, though, Arlington only scored 10 points. So I'm with you here. Orlando is just being incredibly disrespected. This team is a lot better with Dormady at quarterback. And like we've acknowledged on previous shows, sportsbooks are just not adjusting to quarterback changes. I mean, I honestly don't think they're paying attention to it at all. So this is, one of the bigger betting edges I think I've seen.
They just beat DC too.
No, I mean, they're a legit. I mean, if they had Dormady throughout the entire season, I think they would very clearly be second in the South and be in prime position for a playoff spot. I know that we had that championship odds discussion last week. Orlando on DraftKings Sportsbook is plus 18,000. Yeah,
I bet it. I'm not letting this go any farther.
Right? Yeah, plus 18,000 on DraftKings Sportsbook to win the championship. If they win out, and I believe and Arlington drops at least 2 of their next 3 games, they will make the playoffs.
Yep.
And their schedule is Arlington, San Antonio, and then St. Louis. They'll be favored in 2 of those
Yeah.
games.
They
So
might not
that's
even have to
like,
win the St. Louis game
yeah,
if
bet.
with how bad Arlington and San Antonio are.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, betting 100 to win 18,000 on Orlando to win the championship. I mean, I know that obviously it's, it is a long shot. They're still on the outside looking in on the playoff picture, but that is legitimately tempting. If I was in a legal state, I'd definitely be looking at throwing a few bucks on that just for fun. But yeah, I did grab Orlando -1 in this game. I also grabbed the Orlando money line. I believe I got -125. Really like Orlando in this one. Um, Injuries. Pretty clean here. Victor Bolden is questionable after being limited on Wednesday and Thursday with a shoulder issue. And then the only other notable news here is that Luis Perez is expected to start after being traded to Arlington last week. Starting with the Arlington side of things, how do you feel about Perez in this offense?
It's got to be a downgrade from what he came from, what he was working with in Vegas. He doesn't project well. He's kind of he's a little too expensive. Probably not using any of Perez in the 4-game slate anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can argue for Perez just based on ownership. I mean, he'll probably be 2 to 4% owned. So I think you could make a case there. And I mean, he's shown decent scores when he was in Vegas, but I'm with you. Like, this Arlington offense is just really bad.
Really bad.
And I don't expect. I mean, Perez is absolutely a quarterback upgrade over Plitt and Sloter. At the same time, though, I mean, I wouldn't have hope for pretty much any quarterback in this offense, at least for fantasy purposes. It's just pretty brutal. So yeah, I don't think Perez will make his way into my 4-game slate lineups. I do think he's okay if you're just playing that ownership angle. And the Orlando defense is terrible, right? So maybe Arlington comes out slinging with their new quarterback and can actually put points on the board. The wide receiver discussion for Arlington is a little interesting. Obviously, we have Sal Cannella running all the routes, but Victor Bolden and Rennell Hall are both the minimum price. So is Javonte Payton. All of those guys project okay for us. I mean, the problem is that all these wide receivers seem to be capped at a 50% route share for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Do you have any leans at wide receiver here?
I'm probably not avoided on the 4-game slate. I think in Showdown, I think they all are interesting because they're all cheap, and I would probably mix and match. Bolden is probably my favorite of the bunch, assuming he is active. Just because we've seen success from him before, he's definitely working his way up into the offense and getting more playing time. But it's really a big guessing game.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you though. I like Bolden the most. In that game last week, I think his route share would have been higher had it not been for that shoulder injury. But they threw him some screens. Like, there were some plays where he was clearly the number one read. I think, the coaches have sort of come around to him being their most talented wide receiver and their top weapon. The problem is that, like, we've just seen so much inconsistency across the board in terms of both target share and route share for all of these wide receivers. It's definitely hard to trust, but at 3,000, I think I may take a few shots on Victor Bolden on the 4-game slate. If he sits, I think that's probably the biggest boost to Rennell Hall. But that's kind of just my best guess. I'm honestly not sure.
Could be Van Der Esch as well.
Yeah. Van Der Esch also a little bit in play. I mean, it's pretty funny. We have almost all these wide receivers projected between 4 points and 4.7 points. So it's a very narrow band. I mean, you could argue that Bolden being out just boosts all the other receivers by 0.3 or something like that. So, yeah, definitely a dicey situation, but I think Bolden would be my favorite. The backfield conversation here is pretty interesting. We've seen Letty Brown these last 2 weeks earn more snaps than other, backup running backs for Arlington. And we also saw Davion Smith find the end zone twice in week 7. I kind of like Davion Smith this week, especially in, what should be a pretty strong matchup. The major concern there, though, is that Arlington just doesn't move the ball at all. And
Right.
I mean, I think that's kind of always the concern with Smith is, like, we know he's going to get all the red zone work and definitely the goal line work. And he's not quite, especially with Letty Brown working in for about 40% of the snaps, he's not quite the Brian Hill level bell cow, but he's probably the next tier down. But yeah, it feels like a tough click, given the offensive inconsistency we've seen from Arlington.
Yeah, I don't think he's a guy I'll have a ton of, but I think he is decent leverage play off of Letty Brown if people are trying to save money at running back and go to him. Like I imagine Letty Brown's going to be more popular than Smith.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you still need the touchdowns for Smith to pay off, and you're just kind of betting that the Orlando defense continues to not be great, and he is able to get in the end zone, or maybe Perez is enough of a boost to QB to move the offense a little bit more. Yeah, so I
Yeah.
lean. He's just expensive though, like more expensive than you would like.
Yeah, not a great play. I mean, I do think he's if you're looking to pay up at running back, but you don't want to deal with the ownership of Brian Hill or even Abram Smith. I mean, I think Davion Smith will probably be around 15% would be my guess. So I think that's pretty reasonable from an ownership angle. Letty Brown, I basically wrote up as a guy who I think has like a decent floor relative to his price, but the ceiling
Mhm.
just isn't there. I mean, we're
Yep.
not going to see Arlington score a ton of points, more likely than not, and he's not getting the red zone work.
Yeah, so he has to break off a long run, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, sure, like could he gain, 60, 70 all purpose yards and be a decent value at 3,700? I mean, yeah, that's definitely possible. I mean, you look industry wide, we have him projected for about 6.5 DK points. Industry wide, I think is a little higher, but only by about a point. I view like 10 DraftKings points as a ceiling. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on Brown, but I mean, if he's going to be popular, I think I'm just going to fade him.
Yeah, that sounds about right. You're not winning a large field GPP with 10 points from Letty Brown.
Yeah, especially if he's going to be 25% owned. And there are, it's not like this is a week where there are no other solid cheap running backs. Like we have other options that we will get to in a little bit here. Starting with the Orlando side, we'll start with the pass game. Quentin Dormady has looked really, really good. In week 6, he was kind of just overthrowing guys left and right. And then in week 7, he's connecting on all these passes. He's scoring on all of his goal line read options. 6 total touchdowns, the second most DraftKings points in spring football history in week 7 for Quentin Dormady. He's been priced up, but he's still not, terribly expensive relative to guys like DiNucci and McCarron. How are you handling the Orlando passing attack?
Yeah, I definitely like guys like Rambo. I mean, you can stack them all kinds of ways. Rambo, Rogers, Daniel Williams, Cody Latimer. They all project pretty well, and they all are going to play a decent amount. Yeah, and I don't think Dormady is going to be crazy popular because he obviously got a price bump as well after dropping almost 50 DraftKings points last week. And I will say Arlington's defense is one of the better defenses in the XFL. They do seem to limit even some of the better offenses in the league. But like Dormady doesn't have, we're not talking about needing Dormady to do what he did last week to be a good quarterback play. So I'll definitely have some Dormady. And then Rambo is probably my favorite, but he is a little expensive. I just feel like he's due to a big game at some point, with just how much he's on the field and the type of targets that he's getting.
I'm with you there. I think ownership will sort of, center around Cody Latimer. We've seen him be, the most popular pass catcher for this offense for many weeks in a row. And I still think the field is kind of underrating Dormady's upside, which is crazy to say after the 48 DraftKings points last week. But I mean, per 4 quarters, he's averaging 30.4 DraftKings points per game. He's basically tripled Orlando's scoring. And he's averaging 2 inside the 5 carries per game. That number is 250% better than the next closest quarterback. And that would also lead all running backs. I know the sample size is small, but I mean, pretty much everything that you want to see from a fantasy quarterback. I mean, Quentin Dormady is showing you. I get that he's not the best athlete, but he's still running a ton. So I really like Dormady, and yeah, I'm with you. I think Rambo makes a ton of sense. If you're a little concerned about ownership, just getting off Latimer for Rambo makes a lot of sense. And then both Eli Rogers and Dan Williams project as solid values. I'm fine with mixing both of those guys in to save a little bit of salary. Do you have a preference between Rogers and Williams?
I think I lean Williams, but it's not a big lean by any means.
Yeah, man, it's tight. I'll probably have roughly equal amounts of both. I don't have a super heavy lean there.
Yeah, we saw
Um,
Williams route share come way down this week.
yeah.
So I'm not sure why exactly, but his Latimer's also came down a bit, which is also surprising. I don't know. Maybe they're just starting to buy in that Rodgers is better than what they've been using him as, or something. Hard to know.
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. I mean, Katie Cannon was worked in last week. He caught a long touchdown.
Mhm. Yeah,
I don't think you can get there for the 4 game slate unless you're making like a ton of teams. For Showdown though, he's interesting.
sure.
Running back for Orlando, I think is really interesting because I have a pretty strong take here. We've seen these last 2 weeks, Devin Darrington has sort of emerged as the lead rusher. Let me see here. He had a 63% snap share in week 7, which was the highest mark by any Orlando running back this season. He also had 57% of red zone opportunities, 100% of inside the 5 carries, and a 39% route share, which is the second highest mark by an Orlando running back this season. Feels to me like the coaches are buying into Darrington as a lead running back, and maybe he's drifting towards, something resembling a bell cow role. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if we still saw, close to a 50-50 committee this week between Devin Darrington and Jermaine Martin. That said, though, I mean, Darrington has been dominating goal line work as of late, despite being the smaller rusher. I mean, you wouldn't intuitively think that the coaches would be very willing to give him these goal line carries, but they are. He's also only 5,100. And, with Quentin Dormady at quarterback, we've seen backfield production jump by about 20%. So I have a really hard time not liking Darrington this week. And I don't think many people are going to get there because, 1,400 less, you can play Letty Brown, who I think industry wide projects as a better value. And for only, what is it, like 1,700 more, you can get to Jaquez Patrick. Do you have any thoughts on this Orlando backfield?
I think you pretty much hit on it. Yeah, Darrington is he projects as a good value for us, and he's not going to be super popular. We expect Orlando to be winning this game by more than what Vegas seems to think. So yeah, I'll probably have a good amount of Darrington. I'll probably have a good amount of Orlando in general in just most of my lineups, whether it's Dormady plus receivers or one-off receivers or Darrington, and just kind of mixing and matching different parts of it. Just we've seen that this offense can put up points now, and I feel like I want a piece of it because most of the guys are pretty cheap.
Yeah, exactly. And because they're so cheap, like even if Orlando doesn't necessarily have to be the highest scoring offense for these guys to hit on value. But yeah, I really like Darrington. He's been super efficient too. The way I'm kind of viewing this is I feel like Darrington's floor this week is like a 50-50 split with Martin, which at his price I think is still okay. And he,
Still good,
he
yeah.
probably gets most of the goal line work too. So there's that. And then, best case, like he could push for 70% snap share. And
and they're up by 2 scores or something. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So that could be pretty juicy. I mean, and I'd expect him to be around 10 or 15%. I'd be pretty surprised if he got up to 20% given the other options at the position. Any other thoughts on Orlando or this game before we move on?
Nope, we're good.
Sweet. All right. Our third game of the weekend is the Houston Roughnecks at the San Antonio Brahmas. This is a Sunday 3 p.m. kickoff. Total here is 40. Houston is favored by 5 points. Chris, do you have any betting angles before we move on to injuries and fantasy?
Yeah, Houston's being, I think, a little bit underrated here. They are 5-point favorites over San Antonio, and I feel like it should be closer to 7.5 ish range. So yeah, I already bet Houston -5.
Yep, I grabbed Houston -4 earlier in the week. I don't think I like them quite as much as I like the Orlando bet, but I do like them a good amount. You think the total's about right here? I feel like there's a slight argument for the under.
Yeah, it's a little high. Yeah, I think San Antonio's just being generously pushed a little bit with their implied team total.
Yeah, we have not seen the San Antonio offense look great for most of the year. All right, injuries. We have a decent amount to get through here. Brandon Silvers limited on Wednesday and Thursday. I kind of think he plays. Last week he missed Friday's practice and then was ruled out for the game. Him being limited is an upgrade, and I think makes him at worst, 50-50 to play. Something we can get into a little more later. Ben Putman is dealing with a knee injury, but should be expected to play after a full practice on Thursday. On the San Antonio side, Kirk Benkert unfortunately tweeted that he broke 3 ribs. He's on IR, and Jack Cohn is expected to start this week. Jalen Tolliver is also on IR. I'm actually not 100% sure why. I may have missed the exact injury reason. His last listed injury was an illness, so I'm not exactly sure why they threw him on IR. He was dealing with a groin issue before that, maybe something related to that. Calvin Turner is also back on IR. He was never active for a game, but Coach Hines Ward seemed pretty excited about him earlier in the year when he was activated off IR for the first time. I guess he never fully recovered from, I believe he was dealing with an ankle issue. That sort of summarizes injuries here, starting with the Houston Roughnecks side of things. Obviously, it sort of starts and ends at quarterback. I mean, that's the big question mark. Brandon Silvers is still listed on the official team depth chart as the starter. And I think if he is active, he's going to be the starter, and we'll see the same offense that we saw in weeks 1 through 6, where Cole McDonald rotates in mostly at the goal line or short yardage for like QB runs and stuff like that, and Silvers handles about 90% of the pass game work. He's been priced down to 8,900. Chris, can I interest you in some Brandon Silvers?
Yeah, I'd probably have some, but I definitely don't know if I'll go crazy with it. We're currently projecting it at around a 70-30 split. Even when both Silvers was totally healthy earlier in the year, it pretty much was an 80-20 split every week. So just a slight bump for McDonald for now until we get more Silvers news. He did get dropped down a bit, but it's not a ton. And I'm a little curious because now we've seen Silver struggle recently, and McDonald didn't look great now either. Do they lean into the run a little bit more in this game where they should be up and shouldn't have to do a lot to beat the Brahmas?
That's interesting. I think if Silvers goes, we probably see a more normalized pass rate. I tweeted out that in weeks 1 through 6, the Houston pass rate was about 66%. In week 7, it was about 55%. So we did see a bit of a dip. I mean, just watching that game, it didn't look like the team trusts Cole McDonald to really run the offense. It felt like the pass game like really regressed under him, and I think it was mostly just AJ Smith doesn't fully trust him to make progressions. I mean, he's dipping out of clean pockets a lot. It was kind of a frustrating game to watch. At the same time, though, I mean, if Silver sits, I do think Cole McDonald has a ton of juice for fantasy because of his rushing upside.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, because they don't trust him, I'm kind of with you. If McDonald is the starter, I do think they lean a little more on the run game, which would be a boost for Borgie and a lean. Only problem though being that if McDonald plays every snap, he's pretty live to score some of these goal line touchdowns. So I mean, I guess you could argue maybe that cancels out. Let's talk about these running backs before we get into the pass catchers. What do you think about Borgie and a lean here?
The DraftKings just does not seem to want to move Borgie's price. I feel like it's right around 9,000 every single week, and I wish it would just come down a little bit because I think he's an okay play this week. He's just so expensive and just hard to get to.
Yeah.
Aline, yeah, he's a little bit more palatable, but I just don't know what the upside is there either. I really wish either the prices on these guys was a little lower or the backfield would lean, a little bit more one way to one of the guys or something like that. Or if McDonald wasn't in the picture, that would also help. He takes a good chunk of that rushing pie away every week.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think, if I had to decide between the two, I slightly prefer Aline. Aline's looked like really explosive with the ball in his hands. The problem is that he's probably capped at a 30% snap share unless something happens to Borgie. So that's definitely tough. Honestly, I mean, for the 4-game slate, I'm probably just avoiding these running backs. You could certainly make an argument for Borgie, just based on ownership. Aline too. I mean, neither will be very popular, but it feels like a really tough click. I mean, we have pretty solid options at running back at a bunch of different price ranges this week. So, kind of hard to get there. Wide receiver, I think, is a little dicey if Cole McDonald starts, because again, we'd expect a slightly reduced pass rate, slightly worse passing efficiency. If we assume Silver starts, though, I think all these wide receivers are going to go pretty aggressively under-owned. Starting with these outside guys, I mean, Deontay Burnett and Justin Smith are guys that I like quite a bit, and I think they both sort of suffered from Cole McDonald starting. I mean, 100% route share for both guys in one of the league's most prolific passing offenses. If this pass game can sort of normalize to the production that we saw, especially early in the season, I have a hard time not considering both pretty solid plays. What's your take here?
You really think Bird is projecting as a pretty good value? I bet you he comes in a little bit chalky, especially with just being on the Houston offense as well.
Yeah, he would be the one guy that I would say catches ownership. I mean, I think he'll be around 20%. Everyone else, though, I mean, Travell Harris has been priced up to 7K. Burnett and Justin Smith. Justin Smith saw his price go up to 5,100. People just aren't going to get there. They'll all be sub 10%.
Yeah. I like taking shots on everyone but Bird and just hope that you get the right. That's if Silvers is active. If not, man, it makes them pretty all tough to play. Burnett's way too expensive with McDonald. Harris is also probably too expensive at 7K. Smith maybe as the cheapest guy you could work in with McDonald, but that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you can say about McDonald is he's pretty aggressive throwing the ball downfield, and Justin Smith is one of the highest ADOTs on the team. So I think like that pairing certainly makes some sense. We've seen Michael Bandy work in for some slot routes here, and that was part of sort of my bearish argument that I made for Cedric Bird, where look, he projects well industry wide. He projects as a decent value for us. I mean, he's had at least 5 catches in each of the last 4 games. So I think a season high 85% route share last week. I mean, the underlying stats are pretty good until you realize that he only has 1 red zone target all year, and his ADOT's 5.6. So he needs a ton of volume or a touchdown to get there. And, he's getting pretty good volume. But the red zone stuff and the deep targets that we'd like to see just haven't been coming. So if Bird's going to be, pretty popular, around 20-25% is sort of what I'm expecting. I'll have a little bit. I don't think I'll full fade him, but, I'll probably be personally around like 10%, something like that. I think that's more reasonable because I just don't see a huge ceiling with Bird. Michael Bandy, I do think is a little interesting for showdown. I don't think you can get there for the 4-game slate at all. But he is a good player. We saw him start multiple games for the Chargers last year. I've had a sneaking suspicion that the coaches view the slot role in this offense is a little more wide open than they do these outside wide receiver roles, which seem to be more secured by Justin Smith and Deontay Burnett. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Michael Bandy get up to like a 40% route share this week, which could give him some juice for showdown, especially if Silvers is playing. Chris, you got any other thoughts on Houston before we move on here?
Nope, we can move on.
Cool. All right. So San Antonio, like I already mentioned, Jack Cohn will be the starting quarterback this week. We really haven't seen a ton of fantasy juice out of Cohn. Chris, I'll throw it over to you. Do you have any interest in Cohn for the 4-game slate?
No, definitely not.
All right. Well, that makes it pretty easy.
This will be easy.
All right. Wide receiver, though, I think is fairly interesting. We've seen a bit more of a condensed rotation for San Antonio, which is certainly nice. TJ Vasher and Fred Brown both kind of popping as values. Vasher, especially, at least to me, I think is a really strong play. He leads the team in air yards over the last 3 weeks. He's seeing a good deal of end zone targets. It feels to me like he's probably their number 1 end zone threat, and he's only 3,400. Now, of course, the problem with a guy like Vasher, or really any of these San Antonio receivers, is that we are not expecting a ton of production out of the passing game, which makes me a little hesitant to go like way overweight on a guy like Vasher, who I don't think will be super popular. I mean, probably around 10%, maybe 15. Chris, what do you think here?
I just don't think Vasher is very good.
Okay, that's fair.
His talent, like he could certainly at his price, and the amount he's playing, like he could certainly fall into volume, but in terms of like his talent level, I don't like his catch rate is one of the worst in the league, down at like 40%. Fred Brown actually looks like Vasher had negative 1% of the team's receiving yards last week. I like that. I've seen it for a running back. For a receiver to do that is tough to do. I just don't. I don't think he. We're 7 weeks through the season, and he's been playing all the routes basically all season and multiple QBs, and it just doesn't seem to be clicking for him. I have no problem with taking shots on him because of his price level, but I definitely will not. I don't know if I'll play him at all, and I don't. If I do, it won't be a lot. I probably would rather take my shot with like Fred Brown if I'm using one of these wide receivers.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that argument makes sense. I'm gonna have some Vasher because the underlying metrics are so strong
Mm-hmm.
relative to the price. I do think part of the catch rate could at least be explained by the fact that a lot of his targets are coming deep downfield. But at the
Sure.
same time, I mean, I haven't seen him get a ton of separation. Like I'm not particularly optimistic about his talent. So yeah, I definitely understand that argument. Yeah, you'd say you'd prefer Fred Brown overall?
Yep. I think he's just slightly more consistent, and yeah, I don't know. I don't like either of them. That's the problem. So
I
it's like
mean,
tough.
yeah, they're both pretty much the same value
Right.
for us. So I,
Right.
I mean, I think you can go either way. But yeah, hard to have a super strong take there.
Yeah.
I'll play a little bit of both, probably a little more Vasher, personally. Do you think you can get to Landon Acres at 8,200 at all?
No.
I think he's probably in play if you're making 25 or more teams. You could consider him on one or two.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, if you're
For
if you're
showdown, I
having
like him though.
yeah, showdown, he's definitely nice. And I mean, that said, his ownership on the 4 game slate will be super low because he's too expensive. So that could be an argument to play him. I'm not. I don't know. I might have him on a team or two for the 4 game slate, but certainly nothing crazy there. Um, Running back here, I mean, Jaquez Patrick has been a bell cow these last 2 weeks. He's, I believe, since Kalen Balaj went down, he's first among running backs in weighted opportunity, first in snap share, first in route share, and first in targets per game with 5 per game. This is the league's most valuable backfield because these running backs are peppered with targets. It really hasn't mattered that, the offense isn't that good. And it really hasn't mattered who's playing quarterback. These running backs are getting targeted. I believe 9.3 targets per game. Um, yeah, since week 4. So, yeah, some pretty serious receiving work for this backfield. Feels to me like Patrick is pretty clearly, relative to price, the top running back play of the slate. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, he's probably going to be the most popular running back.
Yeah.
So we kind of, I last week I ended up using him a good amount, probably about matching the field, and it didn't work. Fading him would have made sense. He definitely didn't kill you though. He had 10 points, I believe, if I
Yeah.
remember. So not terrible, but definitely not helping you win anything. This week against Houston, which is a good defense, I haven't decided yet if I want to fade him or try to match the field basically again. It's tough to say because his volume is definitely going to be there. He's a little more expensive though. That's probably what it'll come down for me. If it's keeping me from getting into some of the other higher priced guys that I do like a lot more, maybe I'll lean into fading him more. But as in terms of him as just an individual play, he's going to get the work. He's probably one of the best values on the slate, and you just have to decide with the rest of your team how he fits and ownership and everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest issue with Patrick is that one, you could argue his ceiling certainly isn't as high as guys like Brian Hill, Abram Smith, because the offense is so bad. I mean, the TD equity for the San Antonio backfield isn't great. At the same time, I mean, his floor is probably arguably better, but at worst, probably the same as guys like Brian Hill and Abram Smith. So I think like in smaller field stuff, like he makes a ton of
Mm-hmm.
sense. The other issue with Patrick is that he's going to be probably the highest owned player of the slate. I mean, I can't really see a strong argument for anyone else. I think he's going to be 45, maybe 50%. And personally, I imagine I'll come in underweight, if only because I like Devin Darrington so much. But Yeah, I mean, like I don't see a huge like if you want to play 75% Patrick. I mean, I think that's fine. Like, there's certainly an argument for
Yeah.
that.
He's not going to
Um,
kill you.
no, he's not going to kill you. He is, right there with Brian Hill. I'd say is the safest floor among running backs, and he's 3,000 cheaper than Hill. So, pretty easy argument to play him there. Any other thoughts on this game before we move on here?
Nope. We can move on to the best game of the slate.
Yeah, and arguably one of the best games of the season. We have the DC Defenders at the Seattle Sea Dragons. Kickoff is Sunday at 7 p.m. Total here is 46.5. Seattle is favored by 1.5. Chris, do you have any betting angles you like here?
Yeah, I was a little surprised Seattle opened as the favorite with this and is still the favorite. I like the DC side slightly, but not in a big way. It just really depends on what we think of this DC offense and if they can continue to put up the amount of points we see them put up every week, which it just seems like they run a strong offense even though they're not very pass heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like this matchup plays pretty well into DC's hands. I think the strength of the Seattle defense is their coverage unit. I think their corners and safeties are pretty solid. But obviously that doesn't help you much against DC. Not something I personally bet yet, but I do think I am going to take the DC money line here. They should probably be favored. I mean, at worst, I think this game should just be a pick 'em. So yeah, I like DC. Do you have any take on the total?
Um, I lean the over, but not in a big way. It's pretty much around where I would think it should be.
Yeah, I'm kind of there with you. This actually opened at 47.5, came down to 46.5. I don't think I can bet anything here, but I mean, if I had to, I would probably take the over. Injuries, we've got a little bit to get through here on the DC side. Tight end Ethan Wolf, tight end Trey Berry, and wide receiver Jaquez Zard all look questionable after limited Thursday practices. All those guys, I mean, they really only impact stuff for showdown. So we'll have the projections updated and everything to reflect the inactives, but nothing to worry about if you're only playing the 4-game slate there. On the Seattle side, Morgan Ellison is unfortunately on injured reserve. The team has signed Philip Lindsay, who I'm sure is a familiar name to pretty much everyone watching this show. And another important piece of injury news, Jaquer Pearson looks to be questionable after being limited Wednesday and Thursday with a foot issue. Lower body issues for guys who are as quick as Pearson are certainly concerning. So absolutely monitor that. If Pearson sits, Kelvin McKnight he's 3,000 minimum price. He becomes one of the best plays of the slate. That would also be a pretty notable boost for Blake Jackson and a modest boost for Jawan Green. We saw, I believe it was week 1, Jaquer Pearson missed some time due to what was suspected to be a concussion. He got cleared and came back in the game. But for the 2 or 3 drives they held him out, it was Kelvin McKnight who basically took the Pearson role. I mean, the nice thing about Seattle is that they have very clear roles for their wide receivers. They have tiny, quick guys who play the slot, and then they have larger, big body guys who play on the outside. So if Pearson's out, it's relatively easy to project what this offense would look like. But that's obviously a pretty big piece of news to monitor. And it's kind of unfortunate that this is on the last game because it's going to be, tough to gain leverage here without, unless we get, some info today or tomorrow morning. All right. Starting with the DC side of things. Chris, how do you feel about Te'amu? It feels like, he always, at least these last few weeks, he's been projecting pretty well. I mean, we've seen him sort of claim more of this QB role than he had, at least in terms of, snaps, than he had early on in the season. Feels like the team trusts him a good amount. What do you think of Te'amu?
Yeah, I think he's a solid QB play this week. He's not going to be popular. We expect this game to score points. He can do it on the ground or through the air, even though, like you said, Seattle's pass defense has been better. It doesn't mean he can't do anything. So yeah, I'll definitely have some Te'amu this week. His stacking partners of Lucky Jackson or Chris Blair or even Josh Hammond all aren't going to be super popular, and we've seen all of them post spike, or not Hammond, I guess, but we've seen Blair and Lucky Jackson post spike weeks each of the past 2 weeks. So yeah, I think Te'amu stacks make some sense this week.
I agree that Blair and Hammond won't be super popular. I think Lucky Jackson catches probably 25% ownership though.
Really, even he's getting a
Yeah,
little expensive.
he is getting expensive, but I mean 25.6 DraftKings points I think these last 2 weeks.
It's true. Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know. I feel like if this was NFL, the field's pretty sharp. I can't imagine they'd chase, but this is XFL, and I feel like people will want to chase those bigger games. I mean, I like Teamu. I'll have a little bit of Teamu. I think I'm mostly just going to pair him with Blair and Hammond. I mean, I'm debating about just doing what I did last week and completely removing Lucky Jackson from my player pool. Because I do think he'll be pretty popular. I mean, he projects decent for us, but not phenomenal. Certainly not as good of a projected value for us as he was last week. And yeah, I mean, this is a guy who averaged 8.9 DraftKings points per game in his first 5 games this season. I feel like he's a premier fade candidate, but I don't know. These last 2 weeks, those have been famous last words, right? So yeah, if we assume Jackson is relatively popular, in that 20-25% range, how would you want to play him?
Yeah, if you think he's going to be popular, I probably would rather just take my chance with Blair or Hammond. You can also work in at like super low price Briley Moore McKinney, their tight end. He's 2,900. He's starting to. It does seem like he is kind of taking over that tight end role for the team. And if Ethan Wolf is out or even banged up, it pushes him a little bit more. I mean, you're not hoping for anything crazy ceiling wise, but he catches a touchdown, you're in good shape.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely like that call. He's especially tempting if Ethan Wolf sits. But yeah, I mean, even when I think Wolf was back in week 6, he appeared pretty limited. He didn't get a ton of run, I don't think. So yeah, there's a decent chance he would still be a little bit
Yeah, he
hampered by that.
ran 70%, almost 70% of the routes last week. So, and had a
Yeah.
21% target share. You are not going to find that at that price range very often.
Yeah, that's definitely nice. I like that call a lot. At running back here, I mean, we got Abram Smith, who's now 10,300, which is a little tough to swallow. At the same time, he still projects okay. I think we both probably prefer Brian Hill. But if you expect this to be the highest scoring game of the slate, it's easy to play some Abram Smith. Yeah, how are you handling this backfield?
I'd rather probably work in Reichwell Armstead.
Okay.
That is just it's a big price to swallow, and it's going to come with ownership. Armstead's been, since he's been back, Smith's workload has not been quite what it was those few weeks where he was out. I think I'd rather play Brian Hill at that if I'm paying up for a running back, or just to take some shots at Armstead even.
Yeah, I mean, only 11.2 weighted opportunity points for Abram Smith last week, his lowest mark in a minute. I mean, yeah, the team likes Raquel Armstead. I don't think no, yeah, I don't think I'll have Armstead on any 4-game stuff. I'll have a little bit of Abram Smith, but if we suspect Abram Smith is around 20% owned, I'll probably come in underweight there. Hard to get there relative to, given his price relative to how he projects. And, we have pretty strong value options on the board at running back this week. And I don't know about you, Chris, but I think I'd rather pay up at wide receiver overall.
Yep. Yeah. That's the other thing. Yeah. Like with Darrington and Patrick, there's just, it just makes it really hard to get him in there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like we've seen for the most part, ceiling performances have been coming from wide receivers. I mean, Abram Smith had the 42-point game a few weeks back.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I mean, high score for running backs most weeks has been 18, 20, 22 points. So yeah, I think you're better off, especially in like these large field tournaments, using that extra salary to pay up at wide receiver and try to catch a big game there. Moving on to the Seattle side of things, we have Ben DiNucci, who is really expensive. I think he's 12,000. Yeah, 12,000 for Ben DiNucci, which is, man, using a ton of salary if you want to play him. But at the same time, offense is throwing a ton. He's running a lot. I feel pretty lukewarm about DiNucci this week. I mean, I don't want to fade him because we've seen a pretty strong ceiling there. But he's going to be 20% owned, I can't see myself getting, that much more exposure than the field.
No, yeah, that sounds about the amount of that I would want with him. He's going to be tough to build lineups with. All that Pearson news is going to be tough.
Yeah.
I will say Juwan Green does seem to have fully taken over the third wide receiver spot for the team. I think he ran all of the routes last week. Or yeah, not quite. He ran 73, but that was third highest on the team. Josh Gordon continues to get buried in route share by everyone else on the team. So Juwan Green at 4,500 can help alleviate some of that DiNucci salary. So if you play Pearson, your options if he's ruled out are pretty much like Abram Smith, right? Like there's no, in terms of salary, like there's no easy swaps.
Yeah, it's tough. I think what I will probably try to do is make most of my Pearson lineups like relatively heavy game stacks, and then that way, if he's ruled out, I have like a lot more optionality. It doesn't have to be a 1-to-1 swap,
Right.
because I mean, I'm gonna want like a lot of Kelvin McKnight if Pearson is ruled out, and I mean, you don't want to leave like 8,000 on the table for a 1-to-1
Yeah,
swap.
you can't do
Doesn't
it.
make any sense. Yeah, right. So I think that's the way I'm going to play it, where like lineups with Pearson, I'm going to want, at least probably 2 or 3 other guys from this game.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So just don't use Pearson as a one-off in lineups.
Yeah, that's definitely pretty risky. I mean, maybe we get some news, like if it drops that he was a full practice today, totally fine to use Pearson as a one-off, but I think we're still waiting on.
Yeah, you could have a Teamu, Chris Blair, Pearson team that turns into DiNucci, McKnight, and Abram Smith or something like that.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, I'm with you on Juwan Green. Seems to be sort of the favorite number 3 option, or the lead, the leader for the number 3 option in the pass game here. It's interesting that he's like basically one of the only guys on this team who runs both routes in the slot and on the outside, which is why I think, Pearson being out would be a slight boost for him. I like Jordan Vesey. Vesey is, he's a lot of air yards, a lot of red zone targets, solid TD equity. Only 4,800. I think he will be, Juwan Green is going to be one of the more popular wide receivers in the slate. I would suspect he comes in 25, maybe 30% owned. Vesey though, will probably be around 10. I'd be surprised if he was above 15%. So, he's a slightly worse play than Juwan Green in terms of like how we're projecting them right now. But I think for tournaments, like if you want to save on ownership, getting off Juwan Green for VC makes a ton of sense. Damian Willis, still kind of in play.
That's who I thought you were going to bring up. Actually, he ran more routes than VC last week.
Yeah, my problem with Willis is he hasn't gotten the end zone work that VC has. So I just don't see similar TD.
VC's a big guy.
Yeah. They love throwing the jump balls to VC and Josh Gordon are like a staple of this offense.
Yeah, but at 3,600, you definitely can also work in Willis, and he's not going to be popular because of, like you said, he doesn't seem to get a lot of high value targets.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I mean Blake Jackson, probably I think the only guy we haven't mentioned this for this game yet, or for this wide receiver group. He's fine. I don't know. I don't have a super strong take on Jackson. I think, if we projected Jacour Pearson as being out right now, he would be one of the strongest plays of the slate. But obviously we can't do that. Yeah. Do you have a take on Jackson? I don't know. Pretty neutral about him.
Yeah, I feel like I'm pretty neutral about him every week. He's, always a little expensive, but, in a high pass volume offense and can have big games. So, he's totally fine to work in.
Absolutely. Let's cover running back here real quick. And then I think we got a really good question in the chat that I'd like to get to. But so running back, Philip Lindsay is a Seattle Sea Dragon. That's pretty cool. Darius Bradwell has just been really, really bad. For what it's worth, Darius Bradwell is still listed as the starter. But at the same time, I don't think that means much. I'm relatively optimistic these Seattle coaches will come around to Lindsay pretty quickly as their RB1. This is a guy who averaged 4.5 yards per carry in the NFL. Darius Bradwell is averaging like 2.5 yards per carry in the XFL. So it should be pretty obvious who the best running back is on the team. And I think in game we've seen the Seattle coaches be relatively willing to adjust to how their, run game is functioning in terms of both rotations and pass rate. So I'm like kind of optimistic for Lindsay. The only problem is that he's really expensive. He's 7,800.
Yeah, I thought that was a mistake. I was like, did we
Right.
copy this in wrong?
Yeah. No, that is correct. Philip Lindsay is 7,800. So, even if we projected him for 75% of the backfield work, which I think arguably is probably too aggressive, given that he's listed on the depth chart as the backup. Even if we did project him for 75% of the work, he wouldn't pop as a value. So yeah, do you have any takes on Lindsay? I actually kind of like him in GPPs as like a super sneaky running back who could find the end zone a couple times. And he should be efficient in this offense. I mean, I think after DC, this is the most efficient rushing attack in the XFL. They just don't run very much.
I mean, would you rather play? It's really like picking. Would you rather play Philip Lindsay or Devion Smith? And man, that's
I think it
tough.
comes down to how the rest of your build looks with ownership. If I'm pretty chalky elsewhere, I'd definitely take Lindsay over Smith. If I've got some unique plays in that lineup, I'd probably take Smith over Lindsay. I mean, Smith projects a lot better than Lindsay. Yeah, that is a tough one. I think, if I'll probably end up making 30, maybe 35 teams for the the main like $15. I might have Lindsay on a couple of them because he's gonna be so low owned, and I think there's a real chance he could just come out the gates and be the lead back. And I mean, we've seen Morgan Ellison has had big games in this offense, and I think skill wise, Philip Lindsay is probably comparable to Morgan Ellison in terms of like the efficiency that we should expect here.
Yeah. I think you make great arguments. I think Lindsay will be a guy working, especially if I'm not really playing a ton of guys from this game because I want to stack one of the other teams or something. You're going to the points are going to be scored in this game. So throwing in a Lindsay at 1% ownership or something will be, I don't know if it'll be that low because people know his name, but sub 10%, could be a solid play.
I'd be really surprised if he was higher than 5%.
Right.
10% would like actually shock me. But yeah, no, I think he's a pretty solid, like low owned option at running back. All right. Scott Stradamus asked us a really good question. He said last week, the true optimal had 5 of 7 players from the same game while full fading the highest ownership game. Any game this week worth game stacking that high, and any game worth full fading? Chris, do you have a take here?
You can make an argument to full fade the Vegas St. Louis game, especially if McCarron is out. There's a chance that neither of these offenses really get it moving. Other than that though, I don't actually, you know what? I'll change that. I think Houston and San Antonio might be a game you could fully fade. I think the Houston guys are priced up, so they make them tough to play. And we've just seen the offense struggle a little bit recently. Maybe it struggles enough that they can't pay off at their price tags. And then I don't really need to tell you why the San Antonio side could be bad. So a game to fully stack, it's probably the Seattle DC game. Sneakier one though could be the Vegas St. Louis game with McCarron and McClendon is actually a decent QB.
Yeah, I pretty much line up with you there. I think like the thing with the Houston San Antonio game is that ownership should be pretty low there across the board. So I'm not sure you gain like a massive edge by full fading something like that. I mean, just generally speaking, I've been getting pretty aggressive with game stacks overall, and I think that's especially in these like super large field GPPs. Well, I mean, nothing in the XFL is super large, but relatively speaking. Yeah, I think that's helped a lot because you just need there's only 7 players, right? So if you use 4 or 5 guys from the same game and that game goes nuclear, I mean you're in a really really great spot. I mean we saw that with Orlando DC last week. Yeah, in terms of the games though, I think I actually think the sneaky game stack would probably be Arlington and Orlando if you really wanted to risk it there. I mean, I get that it's gross. And then if McCarron's out, I mean, I'm definitely on board with Chris's take that the St. Louis Vegas game would probably go over owned. I don't think the field would correctly adjust, especially on the St. Louis wide receivers. I think, yeah, Shepard and Butler would probably be too highly owned there. And who knows? I mean, McClendon, like, what, over the past 5 seasons has thrown like 170
Right.
passes. So we still, like, he looked good last week, but we still don't know for sure
Right.
if this dude could stink. So I wouldn't be surprised if the St. Louis game was went under, especially with if McCarron were ruled out. And that's a piece of news that I think is going to be really important to bet, because sportsbooks will be very slow adjusting the line. So if you see McCarron ruled out, like, immediately hammer the under and probably hammer Vegas +7. Chris, any other final thoughts as we wrap up here?
No, I think we probably definitely a lot of injury news heading into the week with McCarron, Pearson, and but that was already ruled out. But yeah, still a lot of injury news that could really, really shift the slate in a lot of ways. So just pay attention to Discord. We'll update projections throughout the weekend, and we'll hopefully have a good week.
Yeah. Alrighty, guys. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to the Week 8 edition of the Fantasy Points XFL Breakdown. Really appreciate it, everyone, and I hope to see you all at the top of the leaderboard.